Our next speaker, who can't be here with us today, is going to join us via Zoom. Dr. Hafsa Kanjwal. She's a good friend, and I will read her introduction. And this may be really awkward, Hafsa, but I'm going to be waiting. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Hafsa Kanjwal is an assistant professor of South Asian history in the Department of History at Lafayette College in Eastern Pennsylvania, where she teaches courses on the history of the modern world, South Asian history, and Islam in the modern world. As a historian of modern Kashmir, she is the author of Colonizing Kashmir, a state building under Indian occupation, which examines how the Indian and Kashmir governments utilized state building to entrench India's colonial occupation of Kashmir in the aftermath of the partition. I am going to hand it over to you.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to the Coalition for Civil Freedoms and to Sarwat and Lena for inviting me to speak. So I will be speaking about the targeting of Muslim communities before and also after 9/11. One of the things that people often assume is that the targeting of the Muslim community began after 9/11. But the point that I want to start with is that Muslim communities in the US were also targeted before 9/11, especially as the US changed its policy after the end of the Cold War and started to look more towards the Middle East and Muslim majority countries for its foreign policy interests. Any attempts to have any sort of dissent against those foreign policies were targeted. So, for example, during the war, the first Gulf War in Iraq, the Operation Desert Storm, law enforcement agencies actually monitored American Muslim statements that expressed their concern about the US sending military forces to Kuwait. And then also after the signing of the Oslo Accords in 1993, the community's activism on behalf of Palestine and against the Oslo Accords and the normalization that engendered were also subject to scrutiny. And so anyone who was critical of US foreign policy towards Palestine was already basically being watched and surveilled by the American government. And also in the 3 decades or so after the Iranian Revolution, America was already introduced to a lot of Islamophobic discourses about Muslims, about how they are, the threat that they pose to Western civilization. So those kinds of discourses were already in existence even before 9/11. But then, of course, 9/11 completely transformed and exacerbated many of these policies. And it changed the way that the US government especially looked towards the American Muslim communities at large, domestic American Muslim communities, but then also how American Muslim communities had to position themselves vis-a-vis the government in the aftermath of the War on Terror. So one of the main things that really happens on behalf of the US government is that for them now, every Muslim is a potential radical, someone who can be radicalized, someone who, especially if they have strong political commitments, can commit acts of terror, but also someone who can undermine America's imperial interests in the Muslim world. And so from the perspective of the American Muslim or the American political establishment, the stakes at this time were actually really high. And there was increasing scrutiny on Muslims in America. And of course, the first thing that kind of was impacted was Muslim civil liberties. And so in the few months in October, just 1 month after 9/11, the US Patriot Act was passed by the Congress, which basically increased the surveillance powers and eroded Muslim civil liberties in unprecedented ways. And a national registry was also created. Some people don't actually know about this, but thousands of immigrants from Muslim majority countries were basically interviewed by federal agents. They were called up and they were required to enroll in a national registry. And mosques and Muslim institutions were infiltrated by FBI informants, and many American Muslim organizations were subject to greater interrogation. And then, of course, this is only part of the story. Broadly, the media, the entertainment industry, everyone, like a whole kind of force was put into effect to criminalize and demonize Muslims so that America could go and justify its wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and of course, everywhere else that it expanded after that. And so one of the, of course, what you all have already been talking about is the impact on American Muslim institutions and charities and the arrests of high-profile American Muslim leaders. And so one of the ideas behind both the civil liberties, assault on civil liberties, but also targeting institutions and activists was to create a chilling effect, broadly speaking, within the Muslim community. So the idea that if you are critical of US government policies, if you do speak up, that you also are going to be subject to this kind of treatment from the government. And so that kind of atmosphere of general fear created a lot of shifts in terms of how Muslims dealt with the US government, and many institutions had to rethink their engagement. Another part of the story that sometimes also doesn't get talked about is the role of entrapment. And so a lot of money, resources, intelligence, surveillance was put to basically place paid informants by the FBI into Muslim institutions or into mosques, and basically entrap young men who are particularly vulnerable, to commit or pretend to, or to commit or strategize about an attack. And so in a 2015 study, more than half of all alleged terrorism cases actually involve the use of paid informants that were responsible for concocting the plan in collusion with the FBI. And when those attacks or when those plots would be uncovered, of course, there was super sensational media that would occur that would again demonize Muslims and paint everyone in that suspicious light. But most of the times, the fact that they were actually entrapped by FBI agents was completely missing from the story. And I think there's a lot more work that actually needs to also go into that to tell that story. So the point that I was mentioning earlier about American Muslims and how they changed their tax. So many of them, the institutions, many of them were shut down. Many of them had their assets frozen. Leaders were arrested, detained. And so organizations started to realize that if they wanted to continue running, they had to basically fall into line. They had to either cooperate with or provide some kind of support, legitimacy for the American government's policies, both domestically, but also internationally. And so this is a time when many of these institutions started to, in many ways, replicate the good bad Muslim binary, meaning the good Muslim is one who's patriotic, who does his or her civil duties, is progressive in terms of their political thinking. The bad Muslim is someone who's critical, who criticizes American foreign policy, especially in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, Palestine. And so they started to actually replicate those discourses, but also disciplining their own Muslims within their communities. So if you were critical of these policies, you were seen as someone who was a radical. And that's not just by the government, but also by your fellow Muslim community, members of the community. And so much of the efforts in those immediate years were placed on just simply combating Islamophobia. And Islamophobia was seen as a very kind of unique thing that happens either in the media representations or these right-wing institutions that kind of funnel money towards Islamophobic discourses, but it wasn't linked to America and its policies and the war on terror. So there was really no structural critique of American foreign policy and how that has contributed to anti-Muslim racism and Islamophobia. It was more seen as like it's these individual cases just because people are misinformed, and if they only knew more about Islam, then they would come around. And so that's where so much of those efforts were placed. And in this time, there were two important reports. I'm forgetting the years, but I think one was in 2004 and one was 2007 by the RAND Corporation, which is a right-wing think tank or institute. And at this time, pretty much every institution in the US government and local institutions were all investing money and resources to do research on Muslims. I remember I was an undergraduate in DC at the time, and the Department of Homeland Security, actual Homeland Security, would have these friendly conversations with young American Muslim college students and ask them about their experiences, what their grievances are. And the idea is to make it seem like the government is actually listening and they want to hear your concerns. But rather, what they're doing is just creating data, creating information about you and your community and your proclivities. What are your concerns, so that that can inform their policies as well. And so the Rand Corporation came out with this report, which basically set the boundaries of what acceptable American Muslim political formulations or formations, should be in the U.S. And they said that the government and the establishment should try to fund projects that support liberal and secular Muslims, moderate religious scholars. So this term moderate got thrown around a lot at that time. Community activists, women's groups that were engaged in gender equity campaigns, and moderate journalists and writers. And so this cultivation of a moderate Muslim was reminiscent of hundreds of years of colonial rule prior in Muslim majority countries, but now it was coming home to the US. And so there was really little space in those initial years to speak out against the war on terror, to speak out against American imperialism. I think 20 years since, that's obviously changing. I think there's been enough of a time for people to actually think much more critically, especially given how failed the entire war on terror was and has been. But in that time, it would be very rare to have those critical conversations in communities. People were either just too afraid, or they had frankly drank the Kool-Aid and thought that, that these America's discourses about Muslims and the rest of the world was true, and that something had to change. And so there's also a number of figures. So what myself and Abdullah Al-Aryan, who co-wrote a report on this, called Professional Muslims, that basically were opportunistic, and they utilized this opportunity for Muslim representation in these spaces in the media or in the government, to say that they were representing the American Muslim community. And so the US government was all too willing to work with them, because they were willing to basically pay lip service to these policies. And so things like the Countering Violence Extremism initiatives, State Department sponsored trips, dinners hosted and iftars hosted by the White House, and other American government agencies, as well as the incorporation of American Muslims into the defense and security structures of the US. So a flourishing of Muslims that were working in DC, in the State Department, in the CIA, and also in defense contracting. It's actually shocking to even think about how many Muslims there are present in those spaces. And so that was all bolstered during the Obama presidency, especially. A little bit less so during the Trump presidency, but it's come back since the Biden presidency. And part of what the link to the earlier talk today, the talk right before mine, is that they had to definitely scale back on support for Palestine, and not just scale back, but actually serve as Muslim Zionists who were serving as the Muslim figures that were seen as being civilized on the question of Palestine, and agreeable to what the Israeli state narrative was. And so many American Muslim institutions like ISNA, leaders of ISNA, actually met initially with Israeli political leaders, and spoke to them and made it an issue of like Jewish and Muslim conflict and how that needed to be resolved from a faith perspective, not giving any cognizance to the fact that Israel is a settler colonial project. And of course, a very high profile trip in 2014 by members of different kind of American Muslim political institutions called the Muslim Leadership Initiative, was a trip in which American Muslims went to Israel under the auspices of the Shalom Hartman Institute, which kind of depicted itself as being an interfaith organization. And the idea was that they would be more understanding of why Zionists feel the way they do. And many of them then came back and started to write in the American media, about why, Muslims had to change their perspectives on Palestine and so on. And so there was that intense normalization effort within communities. And it just wasn't that. There were so many other things that were happening on the ground in mosques and in universities and so on. So I'll kind of stop here, but the main thing that I want to say is that even though there was this attempt to domesticate Muslims, to really make them think about their interests as solely being within the confines of the US, and to build this idea that there needs to be a very specific and unique and exceptional American Muslim Islam that can serve as a beacon to the rest of the world, which is so uncivilized. Um, I think in many ways, all of that has failed, because now, especially with movements like Black Lives Matter and more recently the kinds of unprecedented solidarity that we've seen for Palestine, as well as just more critiques that have been mainstreamed about US imperialism and the role of the US in the world, it's very hard for people to now kind of or to serve as those voices of the American empire. They will get a lot of pushback. And so it remains to be seen what will happen to those institutions that were so fundamentally compromised. I think many of them will continue to exist in different ways, perhaps projecting themselves as very progressive on some issues, but certainly not on others. But I think overall, there has been more space created for critical conversations, and hopefully more and more formations will continue to challenge American empire, and to ensure that American Muslims and their political allegiances are not just restricted to serving American empire, and to think more broadly about the ways in which American Muslims have a role to play in ensuring that America's foreign policy towards the Muslim world is fundamentally transformed. So I think I'll end here. Thank you so much for your time, and thanks for the invitation again.
Thank you so much, Hafsa.